The day I turned 67, I thought the hardest part of my life was already behind me. I'd buried my wife 3 years before. Pancreatic cancer. 14 weeks. From diagnosis to the last morning. I held her hand in that hospital room while the machines went quiet. If I survived that, I told myself, I could survive anything. And I believed it. I genuinely believed it. Right up until the evening my son leaned close to his wife at my retirement party and whispered 4 words he never thought I'd hear. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Walter, and I spent 38 years as a structural engineer for the county. Bridges, overpasses, the kind of work that outlasts the man who designs it. I liked that about it. The idea that something I built with my mind would still be standing long after I was gone. My wife used to joke that I loved my bridges more than I loved her. I always told her she was wrong. She always told me she knew. We had 1 son together. I won't say his name felt wrong in my mouth after everything that happened, because that's not true. Names don't go bad. People do. My son was 34 when this story begins. He'd married his wife 6 years before in a ceremony that cost me $40,000, a number I gave freely because I loved him and I wanted his life to start on solid ground. They had no children. They had a nice house in a suburb 40 minutes from mine, a house I had co-signed the mortgage for when the bank raised concerns about his debt-to-income ratio. I did it without hesitation. That's what fathers do. My wife, before she died, had quietly asked me once whether I thought our son had grown into the man we'd hoped for. I told her yes, without thinking twice. She didn't say anything after that. She just nodded and looked out the window at the yard she'd planted herself 30 years earlier. I've thought about that moment every day since. The retirement party was held at my son's house. His wife had organized it, called my old colleagues, ordered catering, decorated the back patio with string lights, and a banner that said 38 years well done, Walter. It was a warm Friday evening in late September, and about 40 people had come, old friends from the county office. My neighbor Barbara, who had watched my dogs when my wife was sick. My accountant, Raymond, who had also become a friend over 22 years. I was standing near the drink table talking to a former colleague about a bridge project we'd worked on together in 2009 when I heard it. Not words at first, just a tone, the particular drop and register that people use when they're trying not to be heard. I turned slightly without turning my head, an old habit, the kind you develop when you've managed project sites full of contractors who talk more freely than they should. And I saw my son and his wife standing just inside the sliding glass door, facing away from the patio. My son had his head bent toward her ear. She was nodding. I couldn't hear the words. Not yet. But I watched my son pull back and look at his wife with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not excitement, not happiness. Something colder than either of those things. I excused myself from the conversation, moved toward the table closest to the door, and pretended to refill my drink. The pension documents, my son said. He signed them last month. Raymond already confirmed the account structure. His wife said something too low to catch. Before he changes his mind, my son said. That's the whole point. While he's distracted with all this, and he gestured vaguely at the party behind him, at me, at everything I had spent 38 years building, we move the secondary account. He won't notice for weeks. By then it'll already be done. I stood very still. I have stood on half-built bridges in winter wind. I have delivered a eulogy for the woman I loved, more than I knew how to say out loud. I have sat in a hospital room at 3 a.m, waiting for news that never came the way you want it to. I know what it feels like to hold yourself together when everything inside you wants to come apart. I refilled my drink. I went back to my colleague. I smiled for the rest of the evening, but something had changed in me, quietly and permanently. The way a structural crack changes a bridge invisible from the outside, catastrophic from within. That night, after everyone left and my son and his wife hugged me goodbye at the door and told me they loved me, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I didn't turn on the lights, I just sat in the dark with my hands flat on the table, and I thought about everything I knew and everything I didn't. The pension documents my son had mentioned were real. 3 weeks earlier, he had come to me with a story about a financial advisor he trusted, a friend of a friend, he'd said. Someone who was reorganizing retirement portfolios to minimize estate taxes. It had sounded reasonable. My son had always shown an interest in my finances since his mother died, and I had interpreted that as care. I had let him sit with me while I reviewed the documents. I had let him explain what each form meant, and at the end of the meeting, I had signed where he pointed. I am not a stupid man, but I am a trusting one, and I had trusted the wrong person entirely. The next morning, I called Raymond before 9. Raymond is the kind of accountant who answers his phone on the second ring because he's already been at his desk for 2 hours. He's 71 years old, has been doing this work since before I started my career, and he knows my financial situation as well as I know it myself. When I told him what I'd heard, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Walter, don't touch anything. Don't call your son. Don't log into any accounts. Just come in." I was in his office by 10. What Raymond showed me over the next 2 hours was not a catastrophe, not yet, but it was the architecture of one. The documents I had signed 3 weeks earlier were not simple tax restructuring forms. One of them was a limited financial power of attorney that gave my son authority to make transactions on a secondary savings account I'd held for 15 years. The account had a balance of just over $240,000. It was, as Raymond put it, carefully exposed. The other document was more subtle. It was a beneficiary amendment that redirected a portion of my pension distribution in the event of my incapacitation. My son had positioned himself and his wife as joint primary beneficiaries ahead of the charitable trust my wife and I had set up together before she died. "He told you this was estate tax planning," Raymond said. "It wasn't a question." "He did," I said. Raymond took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He's not a man who shows emotion easily. But right then he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Walter," he said, "I want to be honest with you. None of this is irreversible. But your son knew exactly what he was doing. These aren't mistakes. Someone helped him with this." That was the moment I understood the full shape of it. This wasn't my son acting on a bad impulse. This was my son with a plan, a timeline, and at minimum, one other person helping him execute it. The financial advisor he'd brought to my house was not a friend of a friend. He was a tool. I want to be clear about what I felt in Raymond's office that morning. I didn't feel sorry for myself. I didn't cry. What I felt was a specific, focused clarity that I hadn't experienced since the early days of my engineering career when I was young and had something to prove. It was the feeling of looking at a problem and deciding, with complete calm, that you are going to solve it. I told Raymond I needed 3 things. I needed an attorney. I needed a forensic accountant who could document everything my son had done. And I needed to understand exactly how much time I had before the money moved. Raymond already had his phone out. The attorney's name was Patricia, and she had spent 20 years doing elder financial abuse cases before going into private practice. She was 63 years old and had the manner of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. When I sat in her office that afternoon and laid out what had happened, she listened without interrupting, made notes in a small yellow legal pad. And when I finished, she looked at me and said, "How much does your son think you know?" "Nothing," I said. "He thinks I'm a retired man who had a nice party last night and is probably sleeping in this morning." She nodded slowly. "Good. Let's keep it that way for now." What followed was the most deliberately ordinary 2 weeks of my life. I returned my son's phone calls within a reasonable time. I accepted his invitation to Sunday dinner. I ate his wife's cooking and admired the new rug they'd bought for the living room and watched football with my son on their couch and acted, in every way I knew how, like a man who had no idea what was coming. Meanwhile, Patricia was working. The forensic accountant she brought in was a woman named Diane, who had previously worked for the IRS for 16 years and had the quietly ruthless energy of someone who genuinely enjoys finding things people tried to hide. Within 4 days, she had identified the movement of $18,000 from the secondary account. A test transaction. Patricia called it, designed to confirm the power of attorney worked before moving the larger sum. My son had done it on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was at a doctor's appointment he'd encouraged me to schedule. He knew your calendar, Diane said, when she showed me the timestamps. I thought about how often I'd mentioned my schedule to him in passing. The small details of an ordinary life. The things you tell your child because you want them to know you, because you hope they want to know you. Yes, I said. He did. Diane also found the financial advisor. His name was Marcus, and he had a disciplinary record with 3 different state financial regulatory boards, none of which my son had mentioned. Marcus had a history of helping adult children restructure elderly parents' assets for a fee, a quiet, ugly business that never quite crossed the line into obvious criminality, but came very close. Patricia said he'd been investigated twice but never charged. He's careful, she said, but not careful enough for what we're building. On a Thursday evening in mid-October, my son called to ask if he could stop by Saturday morning. He had some forms for me to review. He said, tax season, coming up, wanted to make sure everything was in order. His voice was warm and easy, and I had known that voice since it was small. Of course, I said. I'll put the coffee on. I called Patricia immediately after. She said, that's it. That's when he moves the rest. Saturday morning I was up before 6. I made a full pot of coffee, set out 2 mugs, and sat at my kitchen table in the early light with a piece of paper in front of me. Not a legal document, not a financial statement, just a piece of paper on which I had written, in my own handwriting, a list of every account number, every asset, every property, and the legal status of each one, as of that morning. Patricia had helped me spend the 2 weeks prior, methodically transferring every movable asset into a revocable living trust. One, structured in a way that the power of attorney my son had tricked me into signing had no authority over. The $240,000 account he'd already moved $18,000 from was now legally untouchable. The pension beneficiary amendment had been formally revoked and documented. The secondary account that remained accessible, the one my son was coming to drain, had a balance of exactly $12.40. Patricia arrived at 8:30 with a colleague from her office. Raymond came at 8:45. Diane followed shortly after with documentation that was, as she put it, tidy enough to hand to a prosecutor. And at 9:15, because Patricia had advised it given what we knew about the full scope of the fraud, 2 detectives from the county financial crimes unit arrived in an unmarked car and parked 2 houses down. My son rang the doorbell at 9:57. He came in with his wife, both of them carrying the easy confidence of people who believe they know exactly how the next hour is going to unfold. His wife hugged me. My son squeezed my shoulder and said, "Morning, Dad. How are you feeling?" "Good," I said. "Come in. Coffee's ready." They followed me into the kitchen. And then they stopped. Raymond was sitting at the table. Patricia was standing near the window with her colleague. Diane had her laptop open, and her documentation stacked neatly beside it. My son looked at the people in my kitchen. Then he looked at me. "Dad," he said. "What is—" "Sit down," I said. "Please." His wife reached for his arm. He didn't move. "The power of attorney you had me sign on September 8th, I said, has been formally revoked, documented, and filed with the county clerk's office as of 2 weeks ago. The secondary account you transferred $18,000 from on September 22nd has been legally restructured. The beneficiary amendment to my pension has been reversed, and the original charitable trust designation has been restored. Every asset I own is now held in a revocable living trust that your power of attorney never had and no longer could have any authority over." My son's face did something I had never seen it do before. "Dad, I'm not finished." I kept my voice level. I had practiced this, not because I wanted to perform it, but because I needed to get through it cleanly. Diane has documented 23 separate actions you took over the past 4 months to position yourself to access and redirect my assets without my informed consent. Patricia is an attorney with 20 years of elder financial fraud experience, and she will be representing me going forward. And the two men who will be knocking on this door in approximately 3 minutes are detectives who have reviewed the same documentation you're looking at right now. The knock came exactly when I said it would. I don't need to describe what happened after that in detail. My son and his wife were interviewed on my front steps. Marcus, the financial advisor, had already been brought in for questioning that morning at his office across town. There were lawyers called, voices raised, a great deal of the particular, frantic energy of people whose plan has collapsed and who are trying to find the seam where they can still escape through. I stood in my kitchen and drank my coffee. Barbara, my neighbor, had seen the unmarked car and the people going in and out. And she texted me, "Everything okay over there?" I texted back, "Getting better by the minute." She sent back a single thumbs-up emoji, which I appreciated for its economy. That evening I sat on my back porch, in the same yard my wife had planted 30 years before. The trees she chose were large now. The garden had grown in ways she hadn't quite planned, but would have loved. I sat there until it got dark, and then I sat there a little longer, because the dark didn't bother me the way it used to in the years after she died. I thought about what my son had believed about me when he made his plan. He had believed I was grief-softened, trusting to the point of blindness. A man past his peak, who could be managed and redirected and harvested like a field he'd been waiting his turn to inherit. He wasn't entirely wrong about the trusting part, but trust is not the same as blindness. And a structural engineer who spent 38 years finding the invisible places where things could fail doesn't stop seeing that way when he takes off his badge. My wife had asked me, near the end, whether our son had grown into the man we'd hoped for. I hadn't understood the question then. I understand it now. She had seen something I hadn't, the way she often saw things I hadn't, and she had tried to warn me in the gentle, indirect way. She warned about most things because she never wanted to cause pain she could avoid causing. "I'm sorry I didn't understand sooner," I said to the yard, to the trees she chose, to whatever part of her is still in the soil she turned with her own hands. The legal process took 11 months. My son and his wife reached a settlement that included full restitution of the $18,000, a formal civil judgment in my favor, and a restraining order. Marcus lost his license in 2 states and is facing federal wire fraud charges that, according to Patricia, will likely result in a plea agreement before trial. My son served no jail time. Patricia told me early on that elder financial fraud cases involving family members rarely result in incarceration when the victim can be made fully financially whole. I told her I understood. I do understand. I'm not sure understanding is the same as acceptance, but it's what I have. I still live in the same house. The garden is coming back after a rough summer. I'm not the gardener my wife was, but I'm learning. Raymond still does my taxes. Barbara still watches my dogs when I travel, which I've started doing more of now that I'm fully retired and have nothing left to prove to anyone, including myself. A few months after everything settled, I had lunch with an old colleague who asked me how I was doing. "Really doing," he said. I told him I was okay. He looked at me carefully the way old friends do and said, I told him something I'd been thinking about for a while. I said that what surprised me most wasn't what my son had tried to do. People do terrible things for money, and money does terrible things to people. And none of that is new or surprising if you've been paying attention to the world for 67 years. What surprised me was how clearly I could see, in hindsight, all the places where the structure had been weakening for years. The small failures I'd explained away. The questions I hadn't asked, because I was afraid of what answering them might cost me. My colleague nodded. He didn't say anything for a moment. I thought about it. "Now I know where the cracks are," I said. "That's enough." He raised his coffee cup. I raised mine. Outside the window, the city went on, doing what cities do. Indifferent and busy, and full of people carrying their own invisible weight. I watched it for a while and felt, not happy exactly, but something quieter and more durable than happy. Solid. Maybe. Like something built to last.